Okay, now we're going to do 2.5b, and 2.5b is paragraph proofs. So I wanted you guys to see the 2-column proofs before we went into paragraph proofs, which is actually writing out the sentences instead of just labeling it in 2 columns. So with these proofs, you could label it in 2 columns first, and then you just write out a sentence for each of those rows within the column. Okay, that's all it is. So it's the same thing, just in sentences instead of columns. So paragraph proofs are writing sentences to explain why the conclusion is true. Okay, so you have to explain why that conclusion would be true. Each sentence cites the reason justifying why it is true. Okay, so again, each of those sentences is like a row in your 2-column proof. Why did I do this step, then this step, then this step? You're just writing it in a sentence instead of just stating it. Okay, reasons are definitions, algebraic properties, postulates, or theorems, so the same things that we've been using from your packet. A statement that can be proved true is called a theorem. Okay, so just a reminder to you, postulates are already accepted as true. In order to use a theorem, it has to be proved true before you can use it. Okay, so in our examples, I have most of the sentence written out for you. Okay, your homework is going to be similar, except you'll actually have to construct those sentences. Okay, so you can use these to help you. You're going to use these to help you. So example 1, in the figure, segment AE is congruent to segment DB. Okay? And, yep, I don't know if I said that. And C is the midpoint of AE, and C is the midpoint of DB. Now we want to write a paragraph proof to show that AC is equal to CB. Okay, so what I want to do is kind of label this picture the best I can. So I know C is the midpoint right here, and I know this segment AE is congruent to this segment DB. Okay, however you need to label that on your picture, it's ever easiest for you to look at, do it that way. Now I also have C as the midpoint of AE. Well, if C is the midpoint, what do you know about those two sections? They're congruent, so I'm going to label those congruent. I know it's hard to see on this picture. C is also the midpoint of DB. Okay, so again, since C is that midpoint, those two smaller pieces would be congruent to each other. Okay, so just mark up your picture best you can. Okay, however you need to look at it to see what's going on. Now for our paragraph proofs here, we still want to write out our given information. Okay, so part of our given information was that segment AE is congruent to segment DB. Okay, now with that given information, I also had point C. Okay, so C is the midpoint, and I'm going to abbreviate. Okay, C is the midpoint of AE and DB. Okay, so that was my given information. Now I also need to write out what I have to prove. Well, in my statement, I need to show that AC equals CB. So that's what I want to prove. So that's what I'm going to write down. All right, so next, kind of looking through our proof here, Your proof doesn't have to be that many sentences. I believe on your homework I wrote like 2 or 3. That's it. Okay, so it doesn't have to be super long. It's not 4 sentences. There's 4 problems and only 2 of them are proofs. Yeah. Okay, so starting our proof, we have since C is the blank of segment AE. What is C for segment AE? It's the midpoint. Okay, so we're starting with that given information. Now we want to use it. So since C is the midpoint of segment AE, well, we can say CA equals CE, right? That's what we labeled on our picture. But it is also equal to 1/2 of the entire segment. Okay, that midpoint splits that segment in half. So I'm going to add in that extra 1/2 AE. Now that is by the midpoint theorem. Okay, so our midpoint theorem splits it into 2 equal pieces. My next statement or sentence here, we have since C is the blank of segment DB. Well, DB is here. What is C? C is the midpoint of that segment, right? Okay, so we have since C is the midpoint of DB. What can I conclude about those other segments? Okay, so if we have DB here, well, I labeled DC and CB equal. So that's what I want to write.
Are we ever getting to a CDM chart?
Eventually.
Okay, what can we do?
Okay, now just like I had in my first statement, I used this 1/2 piece. I want to use that again here. Okay, so it's also equal to 1/2 of that entire segment of DB. Okay, and do you know by what theorem that would be? I didn't hear you. If I'm using the midpoint to state this, what would that be by? Midpoint theorem. Okay, I still haven't used that last piece of my given. Okay, so I need to use that last piece here. So segment AE congruent to segment DB. Now it wants me to use definition of congruent segments. What is that going to make this? Instead of congruent segments, I'll have what? It changes it to equal measures. Okay, so instead of congruent segments here, using that definition of congruent segments, you can say AE is equal to DB. Okay, since all my other ones have been in equal measures, right? I need to change my congruent segments to equal measures. Okay, so it all has to be in the same form. Okay, my last statement here, well, not quite last, but almost last. We have the multiplication property of equality. Okay, that means I'm multiplying both sides of an equation by the same thing. So if I'm using this statement here, I had DB, now it's multiplied by 1/2. So I'm going to do that same thing to this side. Okay, so I'm going to write 1/2 AE. Okay, so all I did was multiply both sides here by 1/2. Yes, it flipped around. That's okay. Okay, my last one, I'm using substitution. Okay, so I want to use this statement that I just made and see what I can replace it with. Okay, so 1/2 DB is right here. Now that's also equal to DC and CB. And 1/2 AE is up here. That's also equal to CE and CA. Well, since this is my last statement, it has to be what I was trying to prove in the first place. So since 1/2 AE is equal to CA, which is the same as AC, okay, I replace that down here, okay, and 1/2 DB is equal to CB. I replace that down here as well. Okay, so looking back, it's the same process as what you did with the 2-column proofs. You're using what you stated from your given and then your other statements to finally get to your conclusion. Okay, you have to use each and every one of those pieces. You're just adding in a couple words like since and by. Okay, since this is equal to this, then by this theorem I can say that. Okay, it's the same thing. So I want to look at example 2 then. All right, so example 2, I have our given here. Okay, this is basically your given. We're going to use that. So segment BD is an angle bisector in triangle ABC. So I'm just using this piece of information here for my given. So we want to write a paragraph proof to show that angle ABD is congruent to angle CBD. So that's what I'm trying to prove. Okay, so angle ABD congruent to angle CBD. Okay, now over in my picture, I'm going to look back at my given. I'm going to see what it's talking about. So segment BD is right here. It's that angle's bisector. Okay, bisector meaning it splits it into 2 congruent pieces. Now what I'm trying to prove is that angle ABD is congruent to angle CBD. Okay, that's already labeled here. That's what we're trying to prove. Okay, so in this proof, you're basically just using the definition of an angle bisector. Okay, so starting off, we're going to use the definition. Okay, so by definition of an angle bisector, because I want to use that given, right? Given an angle bisector. It divides the angle into how many congruent angles? 2. Now since BD is an angle bisector, okay, that was given to me, angle ABC is divided into how many congruent angles? 2. Okay? Therefore, I can say my angles ABD and congruent to angle CBD. Okay, this one was just using that angle bisector definition. It's basically one step. You didn't even have to make it that long. Okay, questions on that one? Okay. All right, I want you guys to do this top one here. Use that piece of given information and then fill in the blanks for your paragraph proof of what it's trying to say.
multiply and even the and people semicolon there.
I did, I think 2 people.
Okay, so in this first one, this one's really short. I have my given written out. I have angle A congruent to angle D and angle D congruent to angle E. And we want to prove that angle A is congruent to angle E. Well, this is a property in itself. Okay, so again, we always want to start with our given information. So we'll start with since our given, we have angle A congruent to angle D. And again, piece of our given, angle D is congruent to angle E. Okay, so that's our given. We can use, you could have said the transitive property or the substitution property to conclude that angle A would then be congruent to angle E. Okay, so since both A and E are congruent to D, they must be congruent to each other. That's just what your transitive property says. Questions on 1? All right, so number 2 is similar to the first example that we did. So we have segment BC congruent to segment EF. Okay, so BC and EF. I'm going to label this right away here. Okay, so those two segments are congruent. We have M is the midpoint of BC, so M's in the middle, and N is the midpoint of EF. Okay, and we want to fill in the blank for a paragraph proof to show that MB is equal to EN. So those two pieces are equal to each other. So again, we want to start off with our given. So one piece of our given is that BC is congruent to EF. Okay, we also have M is the midpoint of BC, and N is the midpoint of EF. Okay, now we want to prove that MB equals EN. Okay, now before I even start looking at all of these words here, since you won't get those on your 2 problems on your assignment, okay, you always again want to start with your given information. What can you conclude about what you have given to you? Well, I have this midpoint here and this midpoint here. So you could start with either. Well, since M is that midpoint of that entire segment, okay, so since M is the midpoint of BC, okay, I can conclude that MB would equal 1/2 of what? BC. Okay, since MB is half of that entire segment. Okay, and I would conclude this because of what? The midpoint theorem. Okay, so used my given, I stated a statement, and then I said why. Okay, that's one sentence. Okay, next I'm going to use my other piece of my given, which is N. Okay, N was the midpoint of EF. So that's what I want to write out, since N is the midpoint of EF. Then I can say EN would equal 1/2 of that entire segment. So 1/2 EF. Okay? And this would be by what? The midpoint theorem. Okay, so I use those two pieces of given information right here to make these two new statements here. Okay, I still have one more piece of given information, so I need to use that as well. So it was given that segment BC is congruent to segment EF, and I want to change it into equal measures because that's what everything else is in right now. So we're going to use that definition of congruent segments to say BC is equal to EF. Okay, next I'm going to use this statement here, BC equal to EF, and I'm going to use the multiplication property of equality. So if I'm using that property, right, that means I'm multiplying the same thing to both sides. Well, in this statement I had BC, well now I have 1/2 BC. So I also have to multiply EF by 1/2 to get 1/2 EF. Now I'm substituting for something that it's equal to. Well, if 1/2 BC, I'm going to look further up in my proof to see what it's equal to. Well, it's equal to MB. And 1/2 EF, I want to see what that's equal to. Well, it was equal to EN. And then I want to make sure this statement here matches what I had to prove. Okay, so it's the same process as your 2-column proof. You just write out a sentence and add some filler words instead. Okay, I want you guys to try number 3. Try number 3. My wheels is not blocked. So then you want to use that second one. So P is the midpoint of S. T is the middle. Okay, so I want to give you enough time to work on your assignment. This last one right here is very similar to the two proofs you have on your assignment. Okay, so it's really similar to those, so make sure you understand how we're doing this last example. So again, first you always want to start with your given information. So since S is the midpoint of QP, okay, that's given, and P is the midpoint of ST. Okay, so we're using these two. So I want to look at my picture. So I'm using S is the midpoint of QP. Well, since S is that midpoint, I can say those two segments are the same. So I could say QS is equal to SP. Now since P is the midpoint of ST, that means those two segments that create that entire one there would also be congruent to each other. So I could write that out as well. So we have SP equal to PT. Now since I was using the midpoint and I'm saying two segments are equal to each other, that would be by the midpoint theorem. Now don't forget you need to say by what theorem or postulate or definition you're doing that step. Okay, so say why you're doing it. Okay, next I'm going to use the substitution property. If I look up here, I have QS equal to SP and I have SP equal to PT. Both of those have an SP. So I can replace this SP, okay, with PT. Okay, since SP is equal to that PT, I can replace it here. So I'll still have QS, and I'm going to replace SP with PT. Okay, now I still have one piece of my given that I haven't used yet. Well, I have T is the midpoint of PR. Okay, so since T is that midpoint, that segment there is split into two equal pieces. So I can write out those segments. So we have PT equal to TR. Okay, and again I use that midpoint, two segments equal, so that would be by the midpoint theorem. Okay, Now I need to look back up in my proof to see which lines I haven't used yet, just like you did with your 2-column proof. I haven't used the one I just found or the one I found using substitution. So I'm going to look at those. I'm going to look back at what I have to prove. So I need to prove QS equals TR. Well, I have QS and TR in both of these, but both of those are also equal to PT. Since both of those are equal to PT, I can say they're equal to each other. Okay? That would be by either the transitive property, or you could have said substitution. Since you could substitute QS in for PT here. Okay? So now I can say QS is equal to TR. Okay, so this bottom proof here is really similar to your 2 on the front of your homework assignment, so use that as an example. Those ones you're using midpoint, just like we did here. You don't have as many givens, okay, so it isn't even this long. But you can look back at this one to help you fill in those words to make up a sentence, okay, how you should structure that sentence.